The early morning sky hung low over the airfield, heavy with the kind of gray that feels like it's holding its breath. Rain hadn't fallen yet, but the air smelled like it would soon, damp, metallic, and quiet. On the tarmac, a single C-17 Globemaster stood parked, its massive engine silent, its ramp lowered like an open palm. Around it, a small group of soldiers stood at rigid attention, their dress blues sharp against the dull backdrop, faces unreadable but eyes fixed straight ahead. They weren't here for a mission briefing or a deployment. They were here to say goodbye. Inside the cargo hold, resting on a metal pallet draped in the crisp folds of an American flag, lay the remains of a young soldier. He'd been just 22. He'd signed up right after high school, driven by a mix of patriotism, family tradition, and the simple desire to do something that mattered. He'd served with quiet courage in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. And now, after a roadside blast cut his life short, he was coming home one last time. Standing beside the casket, slightly apart from the formation, was a man in his late 40s. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished, every crease sharp, but his posture carried a weight that went beyond the fabric. He'd been through war zones, led troops under fire, buried friends, but this duty, this escort mission, was different. It wasn't about strategy or survival. It was about promise. The military made a silent vow to every service member. If you fall, we will bring you home. And he was the one chosen to keep that promise for this young man. He'd spent the night before double-checking everything. His travel orders, signed, stamped, and bearing the official seal of the Department of Defense, were tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket. His military ID was clipped to his belt. The airline itinerary, arranged through the military's travel office, confirmed his seat and the transport of the remains. He'd even called the airline's military liaison the evening before just to be sure. Everything was in order. He knew the drill. He'd done this before. Now, as the honor guard carefully transferred the casket to a waiting hearse for the short drive to the commercial airport, he took a slow breath. This leg of the journey, the flight on a civilian plane, was always the most unpredictable. Military transports handled these missions with reverence, but commercial airlines? Sometimes they understood. Sometimes they didn't. The drive to the airport was quiet. Rain began to fall in soft, steady sheets, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and red. He watched the world pass through the window, people rushing to work, cars splashing through puddles, life moving on as if nothing had changed. But for one family in a small town in Georgia, everything had changed. Their son, their brother, their friend, gone, and he was the bridge between that loss and the final farewell. At the airport, the contrast was jarring. The solemn stillness of the airfield gave way to the chaotic hum of terminals, rolling suitcases, loudspeaker announcements, the chatter of travelers. He walked with purpose, his uniform drawing glances. Some people nodded respectfully. Others looked away quickly as if unsure how to react. He ignored it all. His focus was narrow. Check in, get the casket loaded, board the plane. Simple steps. Sacred duty. He approached the airline counter, the flag-draped casket on a special transport cart behind him, handled by two quiet, professional mortuary affairs specialists in civilian clothes. He placed his orders and ID on the counter with a calm hand. "Good morning," he said. "I'm escorting the remains of a fallen soldier. We're booked on Flight 217 to Atlanta." The agent, a young woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Lisa, glanced at the documents, then at the casket, then back at him. Her expression shifted. First confusion, then something harder to read. She picked up the papers but didn't really read them. Instead, she turned to her computer and began typing slowly. "Sir," she said after a moment, "I'm not seeing a reservation for a casket." "It's not a regular reservation," he explained gently. "It's a military repatriation mission. The Department of Defense coordinates these directly with your airline. There should be a note in your system under DoD Escort, Priority Handling." Lisa frowned, clicking through screens. "I'm not seeing anything like that." "Are you sure you're on the right flight?" He kept his voice even. "Positive. The itinerary number is right here." He pointed to the printed sheet. "And these are my official orders. This is standard procedure. Airlines are required by federal regulation to accommodate military funeral escorts and remains without delay." She hesitated, then picked up a phone. "Let me get my supervisor." A few minutes later, a man in a slightly wrinkled blazer approached. He introduced himself as Derek, the shift lead. He took the documents, flipped through them with a distracted air, and then looked the officer up and down. Not at his rank, not at his medals, but at his face, his skin, the way he stood. There was no malice in it, just a kind of practiced skepticism, the kind people wear when they've decided someone doesn't belong before they've even spoken. "Look," Derek said, lowering his voice but not enough to be private. "We appreciate what you do, really, but this flight is completely full. Overbooked, actually. And we've got strict rules about cargo. Human remains require special handling, permits, advance notice. This isn't cargo," the officer said, his voice still calm but firmer now. "This is a U.S. soldier, and I have all the required documentation. Federal law." "Federal law or not," Derek cut in, "I can't just override a full flight. We've got passengers with paid tickets, families, vacations planned. I can't bump them for this." A few people nearby had stopped walking. A woman with a stroller slowed her pace. An older man in a baseball cap watched silently. The officer felt the heat rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. Anger wouldn't help the young man in the casket. "Dignity would, sir," he said, meeting Derek's eyes. "I'm not asking to bump anyone. Military escorts on repatriation missions travel on space-available status, but the remains themselves are guaranteed transport. That's not a request, it's a requirement under Title 10 and airline agreements with the DoD. Your company signed that agreement." Derek shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know about all that. All I know is what I see in my system, and I don't see authorization. And honestly, with everything going on these days, we've had people try to scam the system, pretend to be military, you know. I've got to be careful." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. The officer didn't flinch. He'd heard it before in different words in different places. The assumption that he didn't belong, that his uniform was a costume, that his presence was suspicious. He'd worn this uniform for over 2 decades. He'd bled in it. He'd watched friends die in it. And now, while carrying the body of a kid who gave everything, he was being treated like a con artist. "I understand your concern," he said, choosing each word carefully. "But I'm not here to argue. I'm here to fulfill a duty to a fallen American. If you need verification, call the military liaison. The number is on the orders. Or call the Pentagon's casualty office. They'll confirm everything in less than a minute." Derek glanced at his watch, then at the growing line behind them. He sighed, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a national obligation. "I'll see what I can do," he muttered, and walked away without taking the documents. 20 minutes passed. The officer stood by the casket, hands clasped behind his back, staring straight ahead. Travelers flowed around him like water around a stone. Some offered quiet nods. Others avoided eye contact. The mortuary specialists stood silently nearby, used to these delays, but their silence spoke volumes. Finally, Derek returned. His expression was closed off now, final. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "We've reviewed it, and we can't accommodate the casket on this flight. Policy violation. You can rebook on a later flight, maybe tomorrow, but this one's a no-go." The officer felt the world narrow. "Tomorrow?" he repeated. "You're telling me we have to leave this soldier in an airport overnight?" "It's not ideal, I know," Derek said, already turning away. "But rules are rules. He's not luggage," the officer said, his voice low but carrying. "He's a human being who died serving this country, and I am under direct orders to deliver him to his family for burial. Delaying this isn't just disrespectful, it's a failure of basic decency." Derek stopped, turned back. "Look, I get it. It's sad, but I've got a business to run. If the system didn't flag it, it's not my fault. Maybe your people messed up the paperwork, that was it." The final straw, not anger but a deep cold disappointment. He'd expected better from a country that draped flags over coffins and sang taps at funerals. He'd expected that when it came down to it, people would understand what this meant. Without another word, he signaled to the mortuary team. They carefully wheeled the casket away from the counter, toward a quiet corner near baggage claim. Airport security watched but didn't interfere. They knew what a military escort looked like, even if the airline didn't. As they secured the casket in a designated holding area, cold, fluorescent lit next to lost luggage, the officer stood alone for a moment. He placed a hand lightly on the flag just for a second. Not a gesture anyone would notice, but one that carried everything. Grief, duty, apology. "I'm sorry, son," he whispered. We're going to get you home. I promise. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, but inside the weight felt heavier than ever. He pulled out his phone and dialed his command. Then he called the soldier's mother. He didn't tell her about the denial, not yet. He told her the flight was delayed due to mechanical issues. A small lie to spare her more pain, just for a few more hours. As he waited for instructions, he watched passengers board the plane through the terminal windows, families laughing, couples holding hands, people heading home after long trips. Normal life. And somewhere in Georgia, a family waited by a gravesite, not knowing their son's final journey had been halted by bureaucracy and bias. He thought about the young soldier, his name, his smile in the photo his mother had sent, the letter he'd written to his little sister before deployment. He thought about all the times he'd been told, "Thank you for your service," by strangers at airports, only to be treated like a problem when it mattered most. This wasn't just about one flight. It was about whether the country truly honored its promises or only paid lip service to them when it was convenient. But he wouldn't give up. He couldn't. Because if he walked away, who would stand for that young man? Who would make sure he came home with the dignity he'd earned? So he stood his ground, not with shouts, not with threats, but with quiet, unshakable resolve. The kind that doesn't make headlines but changes things slowly, surely, one act of courage at a time. And as the sun finally broke through the clouds outside, casting long shadows across the terminal floor, he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The airport terminal felt colder now, even though the afternoon sun had begun to warm the glass walls. The officer stood near the casket, arms crossed, not out of defiance, but to keep himself steady. His mind raced, not with anger, but with a quiet, focused urgency. He had a job to do, and he wouldn't let this setback derail it. Still, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like a second uniform. Nearby, the mortuary affairs specialist worked with practiced calm, securing the casket in a designated storage area, usually reserved for oversized baggage or fragile cargo. They didn't speak much, but their eyes said enough. They'd seen this before. Delays, confusion, sometimes outright resistance. But never this blatant, never on a mission this sacred. A few feet away, a young couple with a toddler paused as they passed. The woman glanced at the flag-draped casket, then at the officer in his dress blues. She nudged her husband and whispered something. He nodded slowly, then removed his baseball cap. It was a small gesture, but it meant something. The officer gave a slight nod in return. In that moment, he remembered why he served. Not for medals or promotions, but for people like them. People who still believed in honor, even if institutions sometimes forgot. But belief wouldn't get the casket on the plane. He pulled out his military-issued phone and dialed the number for the airline's Department of Defense liaison. The one he'd spoken to the night before. The call went straight to voicemail. He left a message, calm but firm, detailing the situation and requesting immediate intervention. Then he called his chain of command. His superior listened in silence, then said, "Stay put. I'll make some calls." While he waited, he watched the boarding process for Flight 217. Passengers streamed toward Gate B12. Business travelers with rolling suitcases. Families with backpacks and snacks. A group of college students laughing loudly. No one seemed to notice that a fallen soldier had just been denied passage on their flight. Or if they did, they didn't let it show. Then something unexpected happened. A man in his 60s wearing a faded Vietnam War veteran's hat approached. He didn't say much at first. Just stood beside the officer, hands in his pockets, eyes on the casket. "They really said no?" the veteran finally asked, voice rough but soft. The officer nodded. "Said the flight's full. Said they don't have authorization." The old man let out a long breath, shaking his head. "I carried my buddy out of Khe Sanh on my back. Took 3 days. Didn't matter if we were tired, scared, or out of food. You don't leave your own behind. Never." He looked the officer in the eye. "You're doing the right thing, son." Before the officer could respond, the veteran turned and walked straight to the gate counter. He didn't yell, didn't point, just leaned in and said something quietly to the agent. The agent glanced toward the casket, then toward the officer, then shook her head. The veteran nodded, stepped back, and returned to where the officer stood. "Told her I'd give up my seat," he said simply. "Said I'd wait for the next flight. She said it wouldn't matter." Policy doesn't allow it. He spat the word policy like it was poison. Since when did policy outrank a dead soldier? The officer appreciated the offer, but he knew it wasn't about seats. It was about respect, about whether the system saw this mission as essential or as an inconvenience. Just then, a woman in a sharp business suit approached. She introduced herself as a regional manager for the airline, sent down from corporate after someone upstairs got wind of the situation. She was polite, even apologetic in tone, but her words were careful, measured. "I understand this is deeply upsetting," she said, glancing at the casket, "and we absolutely honor the service of our military. But our hands are tied by operational protocols. Without proper advance notice in our system, we can't process human remains. It's a liability issue." "Liability?" the officer repeated, keeping his voice level. "The liability is failing to uphold a federal agreement your company signed with the U.S. government. This isn't a surprise shipment. This is a scheduled military repatriation. The paperwork is valid. The orders are real. All you had to do was verify." She hesitated. "I'll look into it personally. But right now the flight is closing. We can't hold it." As if on cue, the final boarding call for Flight 217 echoed through the terminal. "Final call for passengers on Flight 217 to Atlanta. Please proceed to Gate B12 immediately." The officer watched as the last stragglers hurried toward the gate. A flight attendant appeared at the jet bridge, checking her watch. The plane's engines began to whine softly as it prepared to push back, and still no one came to load the casket. He walked over to the gate one last time. "Please," he said to the agent, not pleading, just stating a fact. "This is the last flight today that connects to his hometown. His family is waiting. His funeral is tomorrow morning." The agent looked pained but shrugged. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't make the rules." He stepped back. There was nothing more to say. Minutes later, the plane taxied away from the gate, its lights blinking against the gray sky. Inside, passengers settled into their seats, unaware that they'd just left behind a piece of America's promise. The officer returned to the casket. The mortuary team had covered it with a protective tarp, but the outline of the flag was still visible beneath. He stood there for a long time, silent, not defeated, just recalibrating. His phone buzzed. It was his command. "We're escalating this to the airline's national office and the Pentagon's casualty branch. In the meantime, secure the remains. Do not leave them unattended." "Understood," he replied. As evening fell, the terminal emptied. The noise faded to a low hum. Janitors pushing carts, distant announcements, the occasional suitcase rolling by. The officer sat on a nearby bench, still in full uniform, eyes never leaving the casket. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, but hunger was the last thing on his mind. Then something caught his eye. A teenager, maybe 16, wearing headphones and a hoodie, had stopped a few yards away. He'd been watching for a while. Slowly, he pulled off his headphones and walked closer. "Is that a soldier?" he asked quietly. The officer nodded. Yes, he gave his life overseas. The kid looked at the casket, then at the officer's uniform, then back at the casket. "And they wouldn't let him on the plane?" "Not today," the officer said. The teenager didn't say anything for a moment. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and started recording, not aggressively, just carefully. He panned from the casket to the officer, then to the empty gate where the plane had been. "Is it okay if I post this?" he asked. "People should know." The officer thought about it. He wasn't looking for attention. But maybe, just maybe, someone needed to see this. Not as a political statement, but as a human one. "As long as you tell the truth," he said. "No exaggerations. Just what happened." The kid nodded. "I will." He filmed for less than a minute, then walked away. Within an hour, the video was online. It didn't have flashy edits or dramatic music. Just shaky footage, a quiet voice explaining what he'd seen, and a caption. "They wouldn't let this officer fly with a fallen soldier's body. Said the flight was full." At first, only a few hundred people saw it. Then a veteran shared it. Then a news blogger. Then a retired general. By midnight, it had been viewed over 200,000 times. But the officer didn't know any of that yet. He was still at the airport, now joined by 2 military police officers sent as backup. They brought coffee and sandwiches, but mostly, they stood guard, silent, respectful, present. Around 10 p.m., airport security allowed them to move the casket to a private holding room near the cargo area. Warmer, quieter, more dignified. The officer insisted on staying. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't leave. Not until the soldier was on a plane home. As he sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of the day settled over him. He thought about the young man in the casket, how he'd probably dreamed of coming home to parades or quiet backyard barbecues, not this. He thought about the family waiting in Georgia, lighting candles, checking the phone, wondering why the escort hadn't arrived. And he thought about the faces at the gate, the indifference, the hesitation, the unspoken doubt. Not everyone had been like that. The veteran, the woman with the stroller who'd crossed herself as she passed, the janitor who'd paused and saluted when he thought no one was looking. There was still decency in the world, but it needed to be louder, stronger. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a reporter from a national news network. "We've seen the video," she said. "Can you confirm what happened?" He took a breath. "I can confirm that I presented valid military orders to escort the remains of a fallen U.S. soldier. I was denied boarding due to alleged lack of authorization and flight capacity. The casket remains at the airport. Do you believe race played a role in how you were treated?" She asked gently. He paused. He'd asked himself the same question all day. He didn't have proof, but he knew the pattern. He'd been questioned more often at airports, followed in stores, asked to show ID even when in uniform. He knew what it felt like to be seen as less than, even when wearing the same uniform as his white counterparts. "I believe," he said carefully, "that if I looked different, if I fit a certain image of what people expect a high-ranking officer to look like, this might have gone differently. But I can't prove that. What I can prove is that the system failed a soldier today, and that's what matters." The interview lasted 3 minutes. By morning, it would be everywhere. But for now, in the quiet of the cargo room, none of that mattered. What mattered was the promise. And he would keep it one way or another. Sometime after midnight, a maintenance worker came by with a space heater. "Cold in here," he muttered, plugging it in near the casket. "Ain't right, what happened?" "My brother's in the Army. I'd want someone to do right by him." The officer just nodded. "Thank you." As the heater hummed softly, casting a faint orange glow, he stood and walked over to the casket. He straightened the edge of the tarp, making sure the flag underneath wasn't wrinkled. Then he placed his hand on it again, briefly. "Almost there," he whispered. "Just hold on." Outside, the first signs of dawn began to lighten the sky. Another day. Another chance. And this time he wouldn't take no for an answer. Morning came slow and gray, the kind of dawn that feels like the world is still rubbing its eyes. Inside the airport's cargo holding room, the officer hadn't slept. He'd dozed off once or twice in the stiff-backed chair, head nodding forward, only to jerk awake seconds later, eyes snapping to the casket as if checking it was still there. It was. The flag, now uncovered again, lay smooth and proud under the soft glow of overhead lights. He'd made sure of that. His phone, resting on his knee, buzzed for the 7th time in 10 minutes. He ignored it at first, but when it kept vibrating, relentless, urgent, he finally picked it up. Dozens of missed calls, texts piling up, emails flooding his inbox, and social media. He hadn't even opened it yet, but he could guess. He tapped the screen. The video from the teenager was everywhere, not just on small blogs or veteran forums, on national news sites, shared by senators, reposted by major networks. The headline on one site read, "Fallen soldier left behind while airline sightees full flight." Another, "Officer in dress blues denied escort duty. Was race a factor?" Comments poured in by the thousands, some angry, some heartbroken, some defensive, but most shared a single sentiment. This shouldn't happen in America. He scrolled through a few. A retired Marine wrote, "I carried my lieutenant out of Fallujah with a bullet in my leg. No one ever asked if I had a reservation." A mother said, "My son's coming home next month from basic. If this is how they treat heroes, I don't know if I can let him go." And then there were the ones that stung the most, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. They see the uniform, but not the man inside it. He put the phone down. He didn't want to be the story. He never had. He joined the military to serve, not to stand in front of cameras. But now, whether he liked it or not, he was part of something bigger. His command called again. This time it was a general, a man he'd served under years ago, voice tight with controlled fury. "They're scrambling," the general said. Pentagon's involved. Airline CEO just issued a statement saying they're investigating, but that's not enough. The family deserves answers. The soldier deserves dignity, and you deserve better than this. I just want to get him home, the officer replied. You will, the general said. But first they need to hear it from you. The press is asking for a statement. The family's asking for you to speak. They say if anyone can tell their son's story right, it's you. He hesitated. Public speaking wasn't his strength. He preferred action over words. But then he thought of the young soldier's mother, the voice on the phone last night trembling but trying to stay strong. She'd said, just tell me he wasn't alone. And he hadn't been, not at the end and not now. All right, he said, I'll do it. By mid-morning, a small press area was set up near the airport's main terminal, not too close to the casket, out of respect, but visible enough. A few reporters gathered, cameras ready. No flashy lights, no shouting, just quiet anticipation. He walked out in full uniform, medals gleaming, cap tucked under his arm. He didn't read from notes. He just spoke like he was talking to a friend. I'm not here for attention, he began, voice steady. I'm here because I made a promise to bring a young American soldier home to his family. He was 22 years old. He signed up to serve his country, not for glory, but because he believed in something bigger than himself. And when he fell, it became my duty to make sure he came home with the honor he earned. He paused, looked down for a second, then back up. Yesterday, I stood at that counter with official orders, with identification, with everything required by law, and I was told no. Not because the plane couldn't carry him, planes carry cargo, pets, extra luggage all the time, but because in their eyes this mission wasn't important enough. Or maybe because I wasn't the right kind of person to be carrying it out. He didn't accuse. He didn't raise his voice. But everyone heard what he meant. I don't know what was in their minds, he continued, but I do know this. When you wear this uniform, you represent every soldier who ever served. Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native, immigrant, born here or abroad. And when one of us is denied, it's not just about one person. It's about whether this country still keeps its word to those who give everything. He ended simply. All I ask is that we remember. Behind every flag-draped casket is a family waiting, and they deserve better than excuses. The moment he finished, the room was silent. Then one reporter started clapping. Then another. Soon the whole group was applauding. Not the kind of applause for a performance, but the kind that says, we hear you. We see you. Back in the holding room, things began to move fast. The airline's national office called directly. This time, not a shift manager, but someone with real authority. They apologized. They admitted their system had failed. They promised immediate rebooking on the next available flight, with priority handling. No questions asked. But it was too late for damage control. Because while the officer had been speaking, something else was happening online. Veterans groups organized. Active duty soldiers shared their own stories of being questioned, delayed, or disrespected while in uniform, especially those who weren't white. Hashtags like "NAR Bring Him Home" and "Escort Denied" began trending. A popular country singer posted, "My granddaddy came home in a box after Normandy. They didn't ask if the flight was full." Even athletes and actors joined in, not to grandstand, but to say, this is about respect. Plain and simple. Then came the call that changed everything. It was from the soldier's mother. She didn't cry. Not at first. She spoke softly, like she was holding something fragile. "Thank you," she said, "for standing up for my boy, for not letting them forget him." He swallowed hard. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you had to hear about this the way you did." "I'd rather hear the truth," she said, than be lied to with kindness. She told him about her son, how he loved fishing, how he wrote letters to his little sister every week, how he wanted to be a firefighter after the army. He didn't join for war, she said. He joined because he wanted to help people, even when it was hard. Then she asked the question he'd been dreading. "Will you speak at his service?" He didn't hesitate. "If you'll have me, I will." Later that afternoon, as crews prepared to load the casket onto a new flight, this time with airline executives personally supervising the process, a group of local veterans showed up at the airport. They didn't come with signs or chants. They just stood in formation near the cargo entrance in old uniforms, some with canes, some in wheelchairs. all saluting as the casket was wheeled out. Airport staff stopped what they were doing. Passengers paused. Even the airline manager who'd denied the flight the day before stood off to the side, head bowed. The officer walked beside the casket, hand resting lightly on the flag, just for a moment. Then he climbed onto the transport van that would take them to the plane. As they drove across the tarmac, he looked out the window. The sky was clearing now, patches of blue breaking through the clouds. It felt like a sign. Not that everything was fixed, but that it could be. Back at the terminal, the video kept spreading. A high school teacher used it in her civics class. A pastor mentioned it in his Sunday sermon. And in living rooms across the country, families watched it together and asked, "How did this happen? And how do we make sure it never happens again?" The officer didn't see most of that. He was focused on the next leg of the journey. But he felt the shift, the way people looked at him now, not with suspicion, but with quiet respect. The way gate agents stood a little straighter when he passed. The way the pilot of the new flight came down from the cockpit to shake his hand and say, "We're honored to fly him home." Still, the victory felt bittersweet. Because none of this should have been necessary. The system should have worked the first time. The respect should have been automatic. But maybe, just maybe, this moment would be the spark that changed things. Not with outrage alone, but with action. With policy. With people remembering that honor isn't just a word, it's a choice we make every day. As the plane taxied down the runway, the officer sat in first class, upgraded without being asked, his eyes on the cargo hold below where the casket rested safely. He closed his eyes not to sleep but to pray, not for himself, for the young man whose name he now carried in his heart, for his family, for a country that still had a long way to go but was finally listening. And as the wheels left the ground, lifting them toward Georgia, toward home, toward closure, he whispered one more promise into the hum of the engines. "We're coming, son. We're almost there." The flight to Atlanta was quiet, smooth, almost reverent. No one made a fuss. No one asked for autographs or selfies. Passengers gave the officer space, not out of fear, but out of respect. A flight attendant brought him coffee without being asked, placing it gently on his tray table with a small nod. The pilot came over the intercom once, not with the usual cheerful announcement, but with a simple, solemn message. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to be carrying a fallen American hero home today. Please join us in a moment of silence." Heads bowed, eyes closed. Even the children grew still. When the plane touched down, a ground crew was waiting, not just baggage handlers, but a small honor guard from the local National Guard. They stood at attention as the casket was carefully unloaded, their uniforms crisp, their salutes sharp. No delays, no questions. Just dignity, delivered without hesitation. From there, a hearse took the casket through the Georgia countryside, winding past pine forests and small churches with white steeples, past fields where farmers worked under the warm afternoon sun. The officer rode in a sedan behind it, window down, letting the humid air wash over his face. He'd been tense for days. Now for the first time he could breathe. But the story wasn't over, not for the world watching. Back at the airline's headquarters, chaos had erupted. The CEO, a man who'd spent years polishing the company's image with feel-good ads about connecting people, now faced a storm he couldn't advertise his way out of. Stock prices had dropped 8% in 24 hours. Major corporate clients threatened to pull contracts. Veterans organizations announced a nationwide boycott. And worst of all, employees were speaking out. Flight attendants, gate agents, even mechanics were posting messages saying, "We would have never let this happen on our watch." The pressure became too much. By the next morning, the CEO appeared on national television, not from a studio, but from the airport where it all happened. He stood near the same gate wearing a dark suit, no tie, looking like a man who hadn't slept. When he spoke, his voice cracked. "I failed," he said, looking directly into the camera. "Not just as a CEO, but as an American. What happened here was wrong. It was a breakdown in our values, our training, and our humanity. We had clear agreements with the Department of Defense to honor military repatriation missions. We ignored them, and in doing so, we dishonored a soldier who gave his life for this country, and the officer who tried to bring him home. He didn't blame a few bad employees. He didn't hide behind policy. He took full responsibility. Are suspending the staff involved," he continued. "Not as punishment, but because they need to understand the weight of what happened. More importantly, we are implementing mandatory training for every single employee, starting today, on military funeral protocols, implicit bias, and the sacred duty of bringing our fallen home. And we are working with the Pentagon to ensure this never happens again. Then came the part no one expected. He turned and walked toward the holding room where the casket had spent the night. Cameras followed as he placed a single white rose on the empty floor where it had rested. "This is where we failed," he said quietly. "And this is where we begin to make it right." The apology went viral, not because it was perfect, but because it felt real. Meanwhile, the Pentagon launched its own investigation. Within 48 hours, they confirmed what the officer had said all along. Federal law and long-standing agreements required airlines to transport military remains without delay. Denying such a mission wasn't just rude, it was a violation of contract and, in some interpretations, federal regulation. Congress took notice. A bipartisan group of lawmakers held a press conference outside the Capitol. "This isn't about one airline," said a senator who'd served in the Navy. "This is about whether we, as a nation, keep our promises to those who serve. If we can't get this right, what else are we getting wrong?" They announced plans to introduce new legislation, the kind that wouldn't rely on corporate goodwill or employee memory. Something enforceable, something permanent. But the most powerful moment came not in Washington or on TV, but in a quiet office at the airline's regional hub. The shift, led the man who'd said rules are rules, and walked away, was called into a meeting, with HR and a military liaison from the Department of Defense. He expected to be fired. Instead, they asked him to listen. For 3 hours, they walked him through what a military escort mission really meant. They showed him photos of soldiers killed in action. They played recordings of families receiving the knock on the door. They explained the centuries-old tradition of never leaving a fallen comrade behind. Not on the battlefield, not in bureaucracy, not ever. At one point, the liaison asked, "If it had been your son in that casket, would you have accepted the flight's full as an answer?" The man didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "No, I wouldn't. He wasn't fired. But he was reassigned to help design the new training program. His job now was to make sure no other employee made the same mistake he did." Back in Georgia, the officer met the soldier's family for the first time. They lived in a modest house with a well-kept yard and an American flag flying out front. The mother answered the door. She was smaller than he expected, with tired eyes and hands that trembled slightly, but her grip was firm when she shook his hand. "You kept your word," she said. "I tried," he replied. Inside, the house was filled with photos, birthday parties, high school graduation, boot camp. The soldier's little sister, no older than 10, peeked around the corner, clutching a stuffed bear. She didn't say anything, just stared at his uniform with wide eyes. Later in the living room, the mother asked him to tell her about the last days. Not the details of the attack, she couldn't bear that, but about who her son was in uniform. Did he smile? Did he talk about home? "He did," the officer said gently. "He carried your letters in his pocket. He told his squad you made the best peach cobbler in the state, and he always said he wanted to come back and teach his sister how to fish." She cried then, not loud, just quiet tears that fell onto her lap, but she didn't look away. "Thank you for seeing him. Not just the soldier, the boy." That evening, executives from the airline arrived, not with cameras, not with press releases, but with humility. They asked to speak with the family. The mother agreed, but only if the officer was present. They apologized in person, not with legalese, but with human words. "We failed you," one of them said. "We failed your son, and we're here to ask how we can make it right." The mother thought for a long moment. Then she said, "My son wanted to be a firefighter. He loved helping people. If you really want to honor him, start a scholarship in his name, for kids who want to serve their communities, no matter their background." They agreed on the spot, and before they left, they handed her a check, not as payment, but as a first step toward that scholarship. They also offered to cover all funeral expenses, though the family had already planned a simple service. But the most meaningful gesture came the next day. The airline sent a letter, not to the media, but directly to every military family who had lost someone in the past 5 years. It apologized for any past failures, promised better training, and included a dedicated hotline for future escort missions, staffed 24/7 by trained liaisons. It wasn't perfect. Healing never is, but it was a start. As the funeral approached, the town began to prepare. Neighbors put flags in their yards. The local VFW offered to provide an honor guard. The high school band practiced Amazing Grace. People who'd never met the soldier left flowers at the cemetery gate. The officer stayed nearby, not as a guest, but as a guardian. He helped coordinate with the military detail, made sure the flag-folding ceremony was arranged, and quietly ensured that every detail honored the young man's life, not just his death. One afternoon, as he walked through the cemetery to check the gravesite, he saw the soldier's father standing there alone, staring at the empty plot. The officer didn't say anything at first, just stood a few feet away, giving the man space. After a while, the father spoke. "I used to take him fishing in that creek behind our house. He'd always fall in, every single time. Said the fish liked to play tricks on him." He smiled faintly. "He was always laughing." The officer nodded. "He had that kind of spirit. Even overseas, he kept people's spirits up." The father turned to him then, eyes glistening. "You didn't have to fight like that for him." "But you did. Why?" The officer thought for a moment. "Because someone has to. Because if we stop standing up for each other, especially the ones who can't stand up for themselves, then what's the point of any of this?" The father reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "You're family now," he said simply. Those words stayed with him. On the morning of the funeral, the sky was clear and bright, the kind of day that feels like a gift. Cars lined the road for blocks. People stood on porches, hands over hearts. As the procession passed, police escort in front, hearse in the center, family behind, and the officer in his dress blues riding in the last car. At the cemetery, hundreds had gathered. Veterans in old uniforms, schoolchildren holding handmade signs that read "Hero," firefighters in full gear standing at attention. The ceremony was simple but powerful. A chaplain spoke. The honor guard fired 3 volleys. A lone bugler played taps, the notes hanging in the air like a prayer. Then came the folding of the flag, 7 crisp folds. Each one deliberate, each one meaningful. When it was done, the officer stepped forward, took the folded flag in both hands, and walked slowly to the mother. He knelt, something not required by protocol, but something that felt right, and placed the flag in her hands. "For your son's faithful and selfless service," he said softly, "and for your family's sacrifice." She held it tightly, pressing it to her chest, and whispered, "Thank you." After the service, people lingered. Some came to shake the officer's hand. Others just stood quietly, absorbing the moment. The airline executives were there too, not in suits but in simple clothes, standing at the back, heads bowed. Later, as the crowd thinned, the officer walked back to his car. He was exhausted, not just from the days of travel and tension, but from the emotional weight of carrying someone else's grief. But he also felt something else. Peace. Not because everything was fixed. Not because racism or bureaucracy had vanished overnight, but because people had chosen to do better, because a community had come together, because a promise had been kept. And sometimes, in a world that often feels broken, that's enough to build on. As he drove away from the cemetery, the sun low in the sky, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The flag still flew over the gravesite, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this moment would mean something beyond grief. That it would remind people what honor really looks like. Not in speeches, not in slogans, but in showing up, in standing firm, in refusing to let a fallen soldier be forgotten. And in that quiet certainty, he knew his work here was done. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. The social media storm settled into quiet memory. But in a small town in Georgia, life carried on. Not the same as before, but shaped by what had happened. The soldier's grave became a place people visited, not out of obligation, but out of respect. Fresh flowers appeared every Sunday. School groups came on field trips to learn about service and sacrifice. And on the anniversary of his homecoming, the local fire department, honoring his dream, unveiled a scholarship in his name, funded by the airline and supported by donations from strangers across the country. The officer returned to duty, but he wasn't the same man who'd walked into that airport weeks earlier. He carried the weight of what happened, yes, but also the quiet strength that comes from knowing you stood for something that mattered. He didn't seek recognition. In fact, he turned down most interview requests. But when the Senate Armed Services Committee asked him to testify about military escort protocols, he said yes, not for himself. For the next escort, for the next family, for the next young soldier who might one day need someone to speak up when the system goes silent. The hearing room in Washington was grand. High ceilings, polished wood, portraits of generals lining the walls. But the officer didn't feel intimidated. He wore his uniform, not as a symbol of rank, but as a reminder of the promise it represented. When he spoke, his voice was calm, clear, and steady. "I'm not here to assign blame," he began. "I'm here because I believe we can do better. Right now, the rules exist on paper, but they depend too much on whether a gate agent had a good day or whether someone looks like they belong in uniform. That's not good enough for the men and women who give their lives for this country." He described the denial, not with anger, but with facts. He explained how easy it would be to fix: mandatory training, a national hotline, automatic priority status for all military repatriation flights, clear penalties for non-compliance. Simple things. Human things. Lawmakers listened. Some took notes. Others asked thoughtful questions. One senator, a veteran himself, leaned forward and said, "You didn't just bring a soldier home. You reminded us what home means." Within a month, Congress passed the Fallen Escort Protection Act. It wasn't flashy. It didn't make the evening news, but it was real. It required every U.S. airline to honor military funeral escorts without delay, provided clear guidelines, and established a federal oversight office to handle violations. Most importantly, it made the mission non-negotiable. No more space available, no more policy issues. Just duty. The officer read the final bill late one night in his quarters. He didn't cheer. He just closed the file, sat back in his chair, and let out a long breath. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever is. But it was a promise kept, not just to one family, but to all who serve. Back in Georgia, the soldier's little sister started saving her allowance. She told her teacher she wanted to be a firefighter too. "My brother's watching," she said. "I gotta make him proud." The scholarship helped her buy her first set of boots. The airline sent her a letter on her birthday. She kept it in a shoebox with her brother's old dog tags. Meanwhile, the airline didn't just change its policies, it changed its culture. New hires now begin their training with a video featuring the officer's testimony and the mother's words.
Every employee, from baggage handlers to executives, must complete a module on military honors and unconscious bias.
And once a year, on the anniversary of the incident, the company holds a moment of silence. Not for PR, but as a reminder. Honor isn't optional. The shift lead who denied the flight. He now travels to bases and airports across the country, sharing his story. Not as a villain, but as someone who learned the hard way. "I thought I was following rules," he tells new staff. "But real rules are about people, not paperwork." The officer heard about it secondhand. He didn't reach out. He didn't need to. Some lessons are best learned in silence. One spring morning, months after the funeral, the officer received a package. No return address. Inside was a small wooden box, hand-carved with a note tied to it with twine. The note read, "For the man who brought my son home. May you always find your way back too." Inside the box was a smooth river stone, the kind you find near fishing spots. On it, someone had painted a tiny American flag. He kept it on his desk, not as a trophy, but as a compass. His career continued. He trained new officers. He led missions. He mentored young soldiers who looked up to him not because of his rank, but because of how he carried himself, with quiet dignity, with fairness, with heart. He never mentioned the airport incident unless asked. But when he did, he always ended the same way. "It wasn't about me. It was about making sure no family ever has to wonder if their child mattered enough to come home." And slowly, quietly, things began to shift. Other service members reported smoother escort missions. Gate agents recognized the uniforms. Pilots made special announcements. Even on commercial flights, passengers would sometimes stand as the casket passed, a small, spontaneous gesture that meant everything. The change wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Real change rarely is. It happens in the quiet choices people make when no one's watching, like double-checking an order, like offering a seat, like saying, "Yes, sir," with genuine respect. Years later, the officer would retire, not with fanfare but with a simple ceremony at his home base. His fellow soldiers lined the path as he walked out for the last time in uniform. Among them were faces he'd served with in war zones, faces he'd trained, faces he'd inspired. After the ceremony, a young lieutenant, barely older than the soldier he'd escorted, approached him. "Sir," the young man said, "I just wanted to say, I saw the video back when I was deciding whether to enlist, and I thought, if people like him are in the military, then I want to be too." The officer looked at him, really looked, and saw not just a new soldier, but the future. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Then make sure you're the one who stands up," he said gently. "Not for glory, just because it's right." The young man nodded. "Yes, sir." As the officer drove away from the base that day, the sun setting behind him, he thought about all the journeys he'd taken, through deserts, through cities, through grief and duty.